Hello and welcome to the 14th episode of Watchtower in Focus, the show that zooms in on all things JW, bringing the governing body and its teachings and policies under microscopic scrutiny. In this episode, we'll be discussing Watchtower's finances, and this is something where I think if I'm going to single out a subject that I get asked to do videos about more than anything, right up in the top sort of 5 would be Watchtower's finances. And I've avoided doing this subject because I frankly just don't have a head for money and cash and accounting, but I can use the might of Watchtower Focus and my co-presenters to try and get a handle on this. And it would be good at this point to introduce Covert Phase, John Redwood, and returning to the show, Evelyn de la Ombre.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
It's really good to have you on the show. And yes, we have a number of videos. This is one of the things that has prompted this episode, is the fact that recently there has been a surge of leaks coming out of Watchtower. And some of these relate to Watchtower's budgeting and finances. Now, there's still a lot that we don't know. In fact, we still don't know anything really when it comes to the total amounts, but there are nevertheless some tantalizing nuggets of information in these videos that give us an insight into the situation with Watchtower's financial status. John, are you surprised at the amount of information we're getting at the moment?
You know, I think maybe if you asked me that question 2 or 3 years ago, I would say yes, I'm surprised. But given the fact that we've had so many individuals contact us, not just former elders, ministerial servants, and pioneers, but we have many active individuals that we can't identify, but that are embedded deep within the society's organization, the Jehovah's Witness organization. And they're supplying us with a great deal of material. And I think it really is reflective of where we are with, you might almost compare it to what went on back in around 1980 and just prior, with the fact that there were so many inside of Brooklyn Bethel, including Ray Franz, that not only questioned the teachings of Watchtower, but were questioning the policies, including the financial decisions. So yeah, you know, at this point, I'm not surprised, and I think we're going to see a lot more.
And Evelyn, I'm wondering if you can talk us through why you feel so many of the John Cedars channel viewers and those who tune into Watchtower in Focus, why so many will be interested in the issue of funds and donations and the transparency aspect.
I think there's a few things. I mean, firstly, the Watchtower organization is always saying how they're growing. Everything is growing. Jehovah is blessing the organization. There is great increase. Secondly, there is the fact that they always harp on about they're not like Christendom. They don't pass a collection plate round. They're not asking for donations. Nobody is obliged to give anything. It's all on a voluntary basis. But thirdly is that people are aware of the fact, even if they're, sort of still a Jehovah's Witness, they're aware of the fact that they are asked on a regular basis, and there is a lot of pressure to contribute on a regular basis, even though it is supposed to be voluntary. There is a feeling that you have to, and that you're asked not just on JW Broadcasting with Stephen Lett, but you're asked from the platform. The elders will read out letters and actually sort of make requests of the congregation. So all of this money comes from the ordinary rank and file Jehovah's Witnesses. It is their money, and they need to know what's happening to it, where it's going. And then you hear all about the court cases where Jehovah's Witnesses are not supposed to know about because they're told not to read about. But these particular court cases that Watchtower is losing, they're having to pay out millions upon millions of dollars in not just fines, but in settlements to victims of the abusive policies that they have. So in many different aspects, it really is, it's a very pertinent question. I mean, finance is a very boring subject, but in this particular regard, it sort of speaks volumes to where the Watchtower organization actually is at the moment, and where it's going in the near future.
Indeed. And again, there's some interesting insights that we can glean from these recent leaks. I know, Kova, you have been combing through this video material and you're going to be presenting a few clips shortly. How would you summarize the quality of information we've received?
So this is actually some really interesting and pertinent stuff, because what you've got, and if people want to go view these videos, if you really want to subject yourself to the eye-watering tedium of hours worth of very, very uncharismatic men talking about money, you can go to the YouTube channel of Fayder, Fayder, where all these videos are currently stacked up. They actually give us quite an interesting slice into what's going on behind the scenes. We don't get like a definitive accountancy ledger where we can see exactly how much money they've got coming in, how much money they've got going out, or where it's all stored. But you get enough to kind of get a fairly good idea of what's going on behind the scenes. And sometimes you also get enough to address certain speculation. We'll get onto it in detail, but sometimes you hear of some of the court settlements and you think, well, how much will that hurt them really? Well, we get some hints in this video as to how much that might hurt them really. And there's some fascinating stuff to go through.
Fantastic. So probably it would be good to get stuck into some of this material, and we have prepared, or you have prepared for us, 5 clips that kind of cut to the chase. So I wonder if you could walk us through the first clip. What can we expect to see? If you could just introduce it for us.
So this is the first video, part 1 of the 2016 finance planning meeting. So let's take a look.
In our program today, we thought we would cover some information that would give you a little bit more background on what some of the concerns are right now. In a little symposium, we want to explain how the governing body thinks about the organization's finances, how the new revised budgeting procedures will work once they're all fully implemented, and just where we are right now with respect to the financial goals that the governing body set for the organization back in September. Then we're going to provide some information on how you can continue to help with this process in the coming months. There are some things that we need you to continue to follow on, and we'll highlight some of those for you. But our first presentation is to address the question, why talk about budgeting in the first place? So please give your attention now as Brother Robert Butler and I discuss the answer to that question.
Over the last few years, there's been some extraordinary developments in our organization. Alex, and you're working with the publishing committee. It must be clear that Jehovah's blessing the worldwide work.
It certainly is, Bob. Think of all the amazing things that have been happening from JW.org, JW Broadcasting, the public witnessing campaigns, as a few examples. It's clear that Jehovah is speeding up the work like never before, and we're all just trying to hold on to the chariot.
And the organization continues to expand into all 4 corners of the earth. It really, though, makes us wonder then, what does Jehovah have in mind for his people today?
It does. Well, Philippians 1:10 says that we should make sure of the more important things. And so the governing body is looking to Jehovah to bless all of these recent developments so that we can move ahead with the all-important preaching work.
Well, it's certainly been encouraging to see how Jehovah's people are fully supporting the preaching work with their personal time, efforts, and then their financial resources.
It is. Donations worldwide have never been higher.
But then how does this increased emphasis lately on budgeting fit into all this?
Well, it's obvious to the governing body that we couldn't expect our brothers to just continue to increase donations. We also had to look at our expenses. And so that to accomplish this, there was a need to reduce personnel, to reduce the number of publications that we're printing, to postpone or even cancel some non-essential construction work, and even to eliminate or reduce some of the services at Bethel.
So budgeting is just a tool then to help the organization to accomplish this. Making a budget is just creating practical plan to estimate receipts, prioritize spending, and then manage the money.
That's right, Bob. So budgeting is really about being shrewd or discreet in a practical way. It helps us to match what we want to do with what we're really able to do. We're taking steps to ensure that every new initiative is fully costed and evaluated before a project begins. Now, admittedly, we realize that wasn't always done in the past as well as it might have been, and that created some challenges for the branches. So we hope that this change will make life a little easier for everyone involved. And the governing body wants you, brothers in the branches, to know how much they appreciate the support that you have given and continue to give to them. Really, you're helping them to be both faithful and discreet.
So that was interesting, wasn't it? So do you remember how, as everyone's aware, we've seen a distinct decrease in the amount of published material. They've announced they're not printing the yearbook anymore. They've scrapped a load of publications. The magazines are getting thinner and thinner. And the quantity of them, they're like slowing the release schedule down. So you only, I think, is it once every 2 months, once every 3 months? I can't remember.
Yeah, I think it's every 3 months or something, yeah.
So the story that they've spun publicly is that this is being done to help the rank and file. It's a better way of distributing spiritual food and letting people get used to the spiritual food that comes out. However, behind the scenes, in the finance planning meeting, we get a direct admission that they need to reduce the number of personnel. So that's why all the Bethelites are going away. It's not because of some grand plan for the field ministry. It's because they can't afford them.
We also had to look at our expenses. And so that to accomplish this, there was a need to reduce personnel.
And to reduce the number of publications.
To reduce the number of publications that we're printing.
So the fact that the Awake is so thin and that there isn't as many of them isn't because that's the best way to spread spiritual food. It's because they're rattling the piggy bank and looking a little worried.
It's just astonishing. And we even had recently on the JW broadcasting episodes, I think it might have been the branch office in South Africa, but they did like one of these like segments where they were interviewing Bethelites who had been sent out into the field. And they were repeating this line that this is all about the ministry and speeding up the work and all of the kind of stuff that they said at the time. But like you say, Covert, when push comes to shove, it's about money.
Yeah, completely.
You mentioned South Africa. I thought one of the videos that I saw actually included a segment where a group of elders was sent to all the congregations in South Africa, and they were being requested to make sure that their tax reports were up to date. And they found that most of the congregations in South Africa were anywhere from 2 to 5 years behind in filing their tax reports. And they also found that many elders did not want to cooperate with it. They weren't interested in accounting. They weren't interested in facts and figures. And many of the congregations had been dissolved in South Africa, so they couldn't even get a hold of a lot of the brothers or the figures. They had been discarded. So really, it actually makes you think that there's a revolution going on a small extent within congregations around the world, where Jehovah's Witness elders as well as rank and file members are beginning to see that this is so bureaucratic and so driven by the bottom line, the financial bottom line, rather than the spiritual bottom line. I think it's actually disturbing to a number of people we're seeing that witnesses just don't really want to be involved in this. Most witnesses are not accountants, and we see this is why they're having these meetings, which I believe Covert pointed out earlier offline, that some of these meetings were very basic information that it sounded like an accounting seminar for third graders. Isn't that the fact, Covert?
Yeah, we'll get onto that later, but we're going to come to that in more detail later. Yeah, it's quite interesting.
And Evelyn, do you have any thoughts?
I do actually think that, just looking sort of now from the outside in, I don't know how elders can actually, I can understand basically how elders would start refusing to do things, because if they're actually only there for the spiritual side of things, and then they suddenly got all of these bureaucratic things on top of them, to do with accounting and tax and having to deal with the government and all of these things, that it takes them away from what they may have become a Jehovah's Witness for, which was to help other people become Jehovah's Witnesses, to preach the good news, and it takes away from that. I mean, I've never been an elder, strangely enough. But
Could have been an elder, definitely.
But the thing is that I just look at it, and I actually think that it's probably the more genuine people that are sort of just interested in the spiritual side of things, that those people that are purely there for the religious side of it, and that in their heart believe it. They're more likely going to be the ones that are now questioning, because if you're happy to do lots of bureaucratic stuff, then it's not an issue. But if you're just sort of like, I'm waffling now, but yeah,
it's a great point.
Okay. Sure. And one thing that you mentioned, questioning, and one thing that does cause a lot of questioning is when you see the organization seemingly abandoning its policy of non-solicitation. Covert, am I right in saying that you have a clip along those lines?
I do. This second clip comes from part 2 of the 2016 financial planning meeting. So first of all, this let's have a listen to see how this brother sets out what the policy, what they say the policy is.
Now, if you ask the question, how do the organization's finance work, scriptural principles come to mind. One of the first principles you might think about is the one found in 1 Corinthians, the 16th chapter, verses 1 and 2. And there Paul wrote, "Now, concerning the collection for the holy ones, you may follow the directions I gave to the congregations of Galatia. On the first day of every week, each one of you should set something aside according to his own means, so that collections will not take place when I arrive." Now, with these few sentences, Paul highlighted 2 important aspects. We don't want collections to happen just because we have an urgent need, and brothers should put aside money according to their means. So that basically says that Jehovah's organization is exclusively supported by voluntary donations. Whatever is set aside by the brothers each month is what is available to support the kingdom work.
So just to add a little bit of perspective on what we've just heard, I think we should play the infamous JW Broadcasting episode where Stephen Lett basically contradicts everything we've just heard.
We have looked forward to this next fiscal year and projected the expenditures for all of the theocratic initiatives we are scheduling. In doing the math, we found that the amount of money flowing out will be much greater than the amount of money that we have coming in at this time. We just felt that you, dear brothers and sisters, needed to be made aware of these expenditures that we're facing in the coming months and years. It is our desire, Jehovah willing, to hold to the accelerated schedule for these projects, if at all possible. rather than having to scale back such progress because of a lack of available funds. The governing body wanted to make you aware of the financial needs in the world field. And we are confident that with this knowledge, your appreciative hearts will move you to do what you can to support the work at hand. Yes, we can honor Jehovah with our valuable things, including the financial support of true worship.
So, Covert, it's just astonishing to see the organization doing one thing when it suits them, but behind closed doors, doing things by the book, or at least professing to do things by the book when it comes to non-solicitation.
Absolutely. I mean, you have it there. The first clip saying, "Oh, we would never shake the coffers and ask for more. What you donate is what you donate, and we're fine with that." And then we've got, in our very next clip, we've got Stephen Lett going, "Oh, so we're running a little short on funds, and we're wondering if you could, cough up some cash." The really fantastic thing about this, as well, without spoiling too much of a clip, is this isn't just cognitive dissonance. This is exquisite cognitive dissonance, because later on in this financial planning meeting, they talk about what Stephen Lett did. So this is one of these weird things that makes you realize that I think that they're not really aware of the clash. We sometimes discuss, are they aware of what they're doing? Are they deluded? Are they unaware? And obviously, and I understand, and obviously that will change depending on how far up the organization you are and what your personal circumstances are. But I think this is an example of how you can have people who literally are not aware that they're contradicting themselves in the same meeting. But yeah, it's hilarious. It really is quite funny.
John, behind closed doors, professing the non-solicitation principle, May 2015 episode, Stephen Lett saying, "We need you to give your valuable things." Do you see a double standard?
Yeah, I think back to the origins of this organization when Charles Russell took all of his personal finances and created the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society of Pennsylvania and ultimately of New York. We still see those organizations play a vital role in Jehovah's Witness culture to this day. So, a person could argue that what Russell did was different than what Rutherford or Knorr did theocratically or doctrinally, but it all goes back to the organization and its policies would not exist were it not for the financial support and the corporations that the United States of America have permitted these organizations, and rightly so, to engage in and exist in. So, I think Stephen Lett is an example of really a double standard, as you phrased it there, where, Jehovah's people have always said, Jehovah is backing the organization. And if that were the case, why would there really be a need to make an announcement for contributions? Because wouldn't Jehovah's Spirit automatically inspire his people? But then they'll go back and use the example of all of the gold and the silver and so forth that was donated to build the tabernacle. And then, of course, Solomon's temple and all of his wealth. I think it really is something for active witnesses to think about is their religion, should it really be built upon financial resources, or should it be built upon truth, accuracy, and spirituality? So there's a great division between the two, and I think that's something that most witnesses should give deep thought to.
Indeed. And Evelyn, do you expect more episodes like the May 2015 episode where a governing body member says, "Listen, we need your cash. Please send it through"?
I do. I think that they're probably, well, maybe not, because sometimes the JW Broadcasting just sticks its foot in its mouth every time. But if they're smart, they will rethink how they do it, and they will be they will be slightly more tactful about how they go about it. They shouldn't be. They should be upfront, because they're basically just asking people to give over their hard-earned money out of jobs that don't pay very much, because of the amount of Jehovah's Witnesses that don't have decent jobs because of their lack of education. So it's really sort of like a sticking point, is that they should be upfront about it, but then on the other hand, they actually shouldn't be asking to start with. But I think if they're smart about it, they're going to have to look at how it was an own goal when Stephen Lett went out there and sort of said all of that stuff. And of all of them that they could have picked to request money, I think that Stephen Lett he comes across as the least sincere. And I don't think that that's deliberate. And I'm not saying that he isn't a sincere person. I'm not going to make a personal comment from that point of view. But because of his personal mannerisms, he was probably the least appropriate person to ask. But maybe it literally was around the boardroom in the governing body's, sort of like office, where who draws the short straw? I don't know. Like, all of them are just like, well, we can't have Sam because, there's the whole Rolex thing going on. So that might not,
Well, apart from anything else, the viewers would all fall asleep if Sam was doing it. Then no one's going to pay anything.
Yeah, Stephen Lett shaking you down for money is a bit like getting mugged by something from Jim Henson's Creature Workshop, isn't it?
Indeed. It's
God, yeah.
I might add that I think the organization really did shoot themselves in the foot here, because they have a procedure already where they can send out letters to every congregation, and they could say privately to the elders, please make an announcement in a very diplomatic way that we need more contributions for the worldwide work. And they chose not to do that. They chose to do it on their world scale JW broadcasting platform, which of course is translated into a couple hundred languages and is viewed around the world. So I believe it was a last minute desperation move for them to have to go to the length of putting it on their tele-evangelistic network. Because think about how we criticized 20 years ago, Jehovah's Witnesses criticized the televangelist who said, God wants you to donate money to this cause. Please, send in your contributions. This is for a good cause. It's for God. God loves you, etc. We criticize that as witnesses so severely, and for them to use that on JW broadcasting, I think is really hypocritical. And I hope that every witness can go back into the literature on Watchtower Online Library and look at the facts and see how they criticized all of those televangelists for doing the very thing that they are now doing.
That's a fair point. And we must make a very clumsy segue from televangelism to spy films, because Covert, I understand you have a curious clip lined up that is somewhat reminiscent of a series of films that you and I both like.
So basically, yeah, so let's go to the next clip, which is taken from the video of part 3. And this is where we get an explanation. We get an explanation in very insulting and basic terms as to what a budget is and as to what planning is from Jason Bourne's fatter, cultier brother.
One dictionary defines a budget as an estimate of expected income and expense for a given period for the future, and then as a plan of operations based on such an estimate. In worldly businesses, budgets are often used as a tool to try to financially control the decisions of departments or managers. But in Jehovah's organization, the emphasis is on planning. And that's in harmony with the scriptural principle found at Proverbs 21:5. The today's English version renders that verse, "Plan carefully and you will have plenty. If you act too quickly, you will never have enough." So it's appropriate that our organization use a system to look at both long-term and short-term planning. It's really an evidence of our desire to ensure that dedicated funds are used wisely. So a budget has two key steps. The first is to look forward and to estimate what the receipts and expenses are expected to be in the future. And the second is to compare what actually happens to what was expected. You can look back over a past year or a completed large project, and it will have some value as it teaches lessons for future budgets. But since the funds have already been spent, the value is only educational. It's much more beneficial and important to watch the progress of spending as it happens. This allows those who are making decisions to see how funds can be used and what adjustments are needed to keep the overall spending within the approved amount.
It shouldn't be this funny. We should be doing serious journalism here, everyone.
It's not really funny. There? It's accountancy, you know?
Yeah.
Jason born again.
He's born into the truth.
So, Kova, while we recover from your introduction to what we've just seen, maybe you can talk us through what we've just seen.
Okay, so I'm just going to... This kind of made me drop my jaw a bit. Okay, so apparently the Born Accountancy doesn't think that his audience is aware of what a budget is. So he explains to them what a budget is. And then later on, he's not sure if they know what planning is. So he gives them the dictionary definition of the word planning. Now, I'm sorry, but I've been in corporate meetings. I've been in this kind of conference call. And if I stood up and insulted my audience the way the Born Accountancy does here, I would be running for my life out of that room. It is, and this isn't the only time they do it. There's lots of videos that got released, and this is a recurring theme in a lot of them that we're not going to cover because we just don't have time. But they so often there's another one where it's a different brother. It's not the Born Accountancy. I think he was out on special operations when they were doing it. But the guy had basically said, so what's a budget? And he talks them through, a budget might be the saving of money to accomplish. And I'm like, you're talking to a room full of adults who are running a multi-million-dollar corporation. How patronizing are you? And either he really doesn't have a very high opinion of his audience, or he's only got 10 minutes worth of material and a 15-minute talk. I don't know what was going on.
Evelyn, for me, this is kind of echoing the dumbing down and oversimplification that we see elsewhere in Watchtower materials.
I think that he was actually talking to his audience with them in mind, because Jehovah's Witnesses are not a well-educated bunch of people. And I speak from experience, having left school at 16 to pioneer. You literally are, you don't have, unless you make the effort to educate yourself in some way, you don't have an education. So things like planning and budgeting won't necessarily be in the wheelhouse of the majority of Jehovah's Witnesses, whether they are higher up in the organization running things or not. And it's actually quite, in one way, it's worrying, but it's also very sad that he has to speak down to these people simply because of what the organization itself has done to them, you know?
And John, do you sense that to some extent the organisation might be reaping what it sowed in terms of its stance on higher education?
Yeah, one of the clips that, I'm not sure if we're showing this part of the clip, but it mentioned that there were 16 time zones involved. So the centralized Watchtower organization in New York was broadcasting this to a very wide audience of elders who were part of the accounting arrangement in various branches around the world. And many of these individuals are from, some are from first world countries, and some are from impoverished countries where they have very little education, just as they actually have very little education here in the United States. So I think this is why they had to dumb this down to the point where they were explaining what a budget is, as Covert mentioned, because a lot of these people who are receiving these videos are in branches throughout the world. And I think it's very difficult for them to have to give this information to individuals that have had zero accounting training. They've never taken a class. I find it interesting because the Watchtower is spending a lot of money on their video productions, such as the Jonah video we've all seen, and they're actually paying to send many of their actors to acting classes. And that's not a cheap enterprise. And yet they're not necessarily paying them to go to accounting classes. So
How do you
where
know
they're,
this? That's the first people to send people to acting classes.
They should
Yeah.
ask for a refund.
well,
Yeah.
that might be Watchtower in Focus 15. We have another video that was just released about.
Is this based on a source?
Yeah, we have a reliable video that we can feature. And I'll
Okay.
send it over to the team very shortly. But the video department just had a meeting.
Oh, I saw a bit of that. I just didn't catch the bit about the acting classes. Okay,
Yeah,
I know
they're
what you mean.
spending money on the acting classes. So where they're spending their money, obviously, is, as Covert mentioned, they're drawing down, they're shrinking the amount of money they're spending on print, because print is dead. And the Watchtowers have just shrunk down to next to nothing. But all of this money is going into video, which is one reason we're seeing a lot of these leaked files, because these files are being sent around to branches all over the world. And there's individuals in branches all over the world that are getting hold of these files and saying, I'm going to leak them out. This is interesting information that people need to know. So thank goodness for transparency.
Indeed, and thank goodness to the individuals who are leaking this information and keep the leaks coming. So if you're watching this and you are one of those individuals, I'm sure I speak for everyone here and everyone who's watching in saying thank you so much for sending this information. But back to this black hole of money being spent, or seeming black hole, one thing you need when you are spending a lot of money is a contingency fund. And that takes us, I believe, Covert, to your next clip.
Yeah. So this clip is taken from the part 4 video. And there's a very, well, we'll let them elaborate, because they mention their contingency fund and they mention how much it was. And then they mention if that was enough.
For the organization's finances to get back on track, a number of initiatives that were begun in September will need to play out over the next 4 or 5 years. So it makes us think of what Paul wrote to the Corinthian congregation in his second letter on the subject of donations in chapter 8 and verse 11. So now also complete what you started to do, so that your readiness to act may be completed according to the means you have available. So we thank you, brothers, for jumping right on the direction that was provided and getting things set in motion. But all of us need to think about this as a more long-term set of adjustments and initiatives. Where are we right now, you may be wondering? Well, it's probably too soon to tell too much yet, but we can update you on what we've seen thus far. Many branches have begun to adjust their staffing levels. Some have postponed certain purchases. And, of course, all of the construction projects that were put on hold or canceled have been wound down, or in the process of being wound down very quickly. We've received the reports from September, and donations seem to have returned to their normal levels in the previous year. As the governing body recently announced to Bethel families, in the months of July and August, there was an increase of donations in response to the May broadcast of around $30 million. That's showing real appreciation and support on the part of our brothers worldwide, and they're to be commended for that. The real estate sales around the world have been accelerated to the extent possible. We have close to 3,000 properties scattered around the globe that need to be sold, many of them smaller properties of limited value, but in total, there represents a substantial amount of future income from the sale of those properties. That's especially true with the remaining properties here in Brooklyn. The governing body having set a firm date where all of the activities will be transferred from the city into one of the 3 upstate facilities, has allowed us to accelerate the marketing plan for our properties here. In fact, just yesterday, the first of those properties, 85 J Street, was put on the market, and over the next few days, additional properties will start being marketed as well. So we expect that these sales will contribute to helping us to transition from our current position to the revised operating budget that the governing body is working towards. We appreciate that you brothers have taken a look at your potential purchases of equipment and vehicles and have canceled some of those and postponed others. In our total picture, that doesn't represent too big of an impact, but it certainly moves us in the right direction, and we appreciate that. Brother Moritz explained that in September, the governing body set up a $25 million contingency for new spending for new initiatives for the 2016 service year. We've pretty much spent that already as we've trying to catch up with budget items and information flows that still need to be tightened up. So for the rest of this year, unless the financial picture changes from where it sits right now, we'll have to be cautious about starting many new initiatives. As you can see from this quick summary, good progress has been made, and the governing body is very pleased with the support that's being provided. But we're going to need to stay vigilant, not only throughout the rest of this service year, but likely in the next 2 or 3 years to come. Staffing reductions are only one part of the adjustments that are needed. We also need to balance our overall expenses with what the brothers are able to donate. So operating expenses will likely continue to be reduced in the next 3 or 4 years.
Okay, so we've had 3 clips there. We basically took all the good stuff out so you guys didn't have to suffer through the rest of it. The first clip is there, a blatant admission they need to get the organization's finances back on track. Now, granted, I suspect they're being, even though it's an internal call, they're being far more diplomatic. They're trying to spin this, but that's a pretty blatant admission that they've got problems. And if you start to read between the lines of what comes next, you start to see how much. So we have them talk about Let's Broadcasting request for money, which ironically in the very same seminar is something they said they don't do. It got them 30 million. So it gives you an idea of right now, if they squeeze, or at least in 2016, they squeezed the brothers, they got 30 million. It wasn't enough. It was a short-term fix. Then they also discussed the fact that they had a 25 million contingency fund. The contingency fund was spent too soon. So that's in 2015, because remember, I think these are talking about what happened in 2015, this 2016 meeting. They had an extra 75 million got splurged, and it wasn't enough, and they've still got problems. It did not help them get back on track. So when he says, with that implication of we need to get the organization's finances back on track, I think he's putting quite a positive spin on something which is clearly a bit painful.
One thing that I hear a lot of, and any of you guys are welcome to pitch in on this. One thing that you often hear when you talk about Watchtower's finances is people will quote the Brooklyn sales, and they will say, well, look, they made $1 billion selling property in Brooklyn. I actually think it's more like 1.5 billion, but we're talking a lot of money. And they'll cite that figure and they'll say, therefore, Watchtower can't be broke. Therefore, Watchtower can't be held up because they got all this money. My argument, and I don't know whether this is something you guys agree with, is that it doesn't matter whether it was 1.5 or 2.5 or 3.5 if they're spending enough throughout the year that money gets swallowed up. So in other words, if we don't know what their income expenditure is, it's really irrelevant how much they make at any given point in history. What matters is how much they're spending.
And also, that money, then they had to build the Warwick offices. So it wasn't like that money was then free money that they could just invest or stick in the bank or plow back into the printing or the preaching work.
Although Warwick was built at an absolute fraction of what they made, but I take your point. Yeah, there's still things to spend it on. Yeah.
You know, and they've still got sort of projects going on around the world that they were obviously committed to. And if you are spending, I mean, if this is just the overspending each year, then that means that they're actually spending a lot more every year. And $1 billion sounds like a lot, but it's only 1,000 million, isn't it? So it's not actually, it's not actually that much. It sounds massive to just an ordinary person, but when you're talking about an international corporation, it's actually not that much at all. They're in hundreds of countries, and it really, really isn't a lot.
And it's worth pointing out as well, and this is something, if you view all of these videos, which I only recommend doing if you can inject amphetamines directly into your jugular, because they are that boring, they actually infer that the
John Cedars channel does not support the
injection of amphetamines. If you watch all of this, they make it very clear that they factored in the sale of Brooklyn. All of the money that they're going to make, they've factored in, and we'll go on to this in a bit later, but they're still saying we drastically need to slash expenses. So even with the $1 billion or the $1.5 billion or however much they got, which they knew they were going to get when they do all these videos, and this comes up again in 2018 after, which are videos we're not going to cover, but they do confirm this. Even with that money, they are still talking about the urgent need to slash budgets. So that confirms, I think, what you're saying, John, in that it doesn't matter how much money you get in. If you are splurging money out, and if you've been eating into your reserves for quite a while, that $1 billion can go surprisingly quickly.
I think we have a lot of clues, and you all made some very good points. One of them is, and I think Evelyn brought this up about the branches that are around the world. First of all, we have the UK branch, and you would think that many of these branches should be self-sufficient, that they would be able to support themselves on their own donations. However, that announcement was made 2 to 3 years ago that the UK branch construction project in Chelmsford was put on hold at that time. Now, we know it's since been picked back up again, and it's going to be completed soon. But the finances were so bad at that point that they had to cut a lot of those, what they called unnecessary projects. And that included Chelmsford, but it included dozens of other projects. And there was even an announcement where they had those branch offices around the world had to sell as much equipment as they could to generate cash. And the other thing is that, speaking of branches not being self-sufficient, most of the third world country branches are absolutely not self-sufficient. And I'll just give you one example, the branch in Malawi, Africa. That branch has got a multi-million-dollar complex, but there are no donations coming in, almost zero donations from local witnesses. And, you know, I do have inside information on that all of the money for the Malawi branch came from the United States branch. The United States branch supports dozens, if not more than 100 branches around the world who are not self-sufficient, who cannot generate enough contributions to build their own branches. That is what is extremely taxing to the financial resources, so much so that back in 2012, around the time of the Candace Conti trial and verdict, Lloyd, I think you and I were talking about this the other day, the Watchtower organization had received the initial judgment against them for more than $26 million, and they actually had to put up a bond while it was in appeal. And they went to the court and said, we don't have enough cash, and they attempted to put up the entire Patterson, New York complex because they didn't have enough cash to put that bond up for the money that they were allegedly going to have to pay out in the Conti trial. The judge said no, and they actually had to go to a bank in Chicago and pay $80,000 or more per year as interest on that bond in order to secure what they had to do for that Candace Conti settlement. So I think that was a very good indication of the fact that Watchtower is, a lot of their money is tied up in real estate, and they're not cash liquid. And this is why they need those contributions.
And it just to finally to pick up on that point you said, John. The question is sometimes asked when we see these settlements. For in the last 18 months, we've had the Campos settlements, we've had Fessler. These we can see that these were in all probability multi-million-dollar settlements. And the question sometimes raised, well, how much does that really hurt Watchtower? Well, their contingency fund for 2016 was 25 million, and they blew through it all.
Yeah.
That's what probably both of the Campos settlements. Throw the Fessler settlement in there, that's almost certainly over 25 million, all those three combined. And I'm not saying that that's the contingency fund that went, because obviously the times don't work, but it does give you an idea of how much spare money they can throw around. So I don't think they can afford to start settling multi-million-dollar lawsuits left, right, and center. Based on what we're seeing here, I don't think they have that kind of cash lying around.
No, it's intriguing when you think of the numbers that we've heard or have been suggested from lawsuits. It's intriguing to think that their contingency is only 25 million. And actually, one thing that I was fascinated about when I heard about this $30 million extra that Let's Pitch received, it made me curious about a little detail that was included in a subsequent Stephen Lett JW broadcasting episode. So I did some digging. Now, you may need to bear with me here, as I've already indicated, finances and money is not my forte. In fact, maths was one of my worst subjects at school. Nevertheless, I was fascinated at the idea of using two different bits of information related to the same accounting period to see if we could learn anything about Watchtower's finances. Because, as you will remember, in the January 2016 JW broadcasting episode, Stephen Lett said this.
In the May 2015 monthly program, we shared our interest in expediting the construction of new kingdom halls and remote translation offices. And we explained some of the financial challenges we were facing in being able to do so. We discerned that contributions immediately went up by more than 15% for the months of June and July. We thank you very much.
So we know that for the months of June and July 2015, donations went up by 15%. That was an isolated figure that we couldn't really do anything with because we didn't know how much money that figure of 15% represented. But then we got these latest leaks, including the following piece of information.
As the governing body recently announced to Bethel families, in the months of July and August, there was an increase of donations in response to the May broadcast of around $30 million. That's showing real appreciation and support on the part of our brothers worldwide, and they're to be commended for that.
Now, obviously, these aren't exactly the same months, but we do have an overlap. So Stephen Lett talks about June and July, and Alex Reinmuller talks about July and August, which means that for the month of July, we not only know how much donations went up by as a percentage, but how much they went up by as a dollar amount. Once we have those two pieces of information, it should be possible to then extrapolate how much money the organization receives in donations on a monthly basis, and hence give us some idea of how much money the organization receives in donations on a yearly basis. So if we take that figure of $30 million for August, assuming that the 30 million is not just over the July-August period, but there was 30 million in July and 30 million for August. Assuming that, and knowing as we do that that represents a 15% increase, that would mean that the regular contributions for August 2015 would be in the region of $200 million. And if we multiply $200 million by 12, we get a yearly figure of, wait for it, $2.4 billion. Now again, I am by no means a financial whiz. This is just me plucking some figures that are authenticated because they're coming directly from Watchtower. There are a certain number of variables. We don't know, for example, whether it's 30 million per month for July and August or 30 million for the period. But you look at $2.4 billion and you think that is a ridiculous amount of money. Surely the organization isn't receiving $2.4 billion a year in donations. But then I thought, what would be a simple way of verifying whether that figure is realistic or not? And then I remembered that there are 90 branches as of the latest service year report. So if we divide $2.4 billion by 90, we get an average contribution per branch of $26.7 million. And this is starting to sound more credible, more realistic. And to give you, and just to illustrate that, allow me to give you the amount received by the Britain branch alone in donations for the past reporting period. It was £60.88 million. And bear in mind that you can expect a higher than average yield of donations from a branch like Britain compared to a branch in one of the African countries, for example. So this figure of 2.4 billion that I've arrived at by mixing those two pieces of information sounds fairly plausible. But again, I am no financial whiz. I would defer to the expertise of people who are more knowledgeable than me in this field, but I thought it might be interesting if I share that with you. So anyway, I hope you found that interesting, and we now need to move to our final clip covert, which, as I understand it, had something to do with questions and answers.
That's correct. So the final clip this is part 5. All of the people get together, including the Bourne Accountancy, who obviously came back off operations and is able to, waddle out of McDonald's and sit down. They basically all get asked a series of Q&A from the various branches and the various people who've kind of tuned in for this. And we get some interesting information from this. So let's roll the clip.
Another question just came in. The question is, if we were able to achieve a 20% reduction this year, does that mean that the additional reduction is not required next year? So, Reinmüller, would you like to answer this question?
We'll be better able to answer that question next year. It's, as we mentioned earlier, we're with so many different changes and initiatives happening at the same time. A lot will depend on how all of those initiatives turn out. So at the moment, the projections show that we need that overall 25% reduction over 5 years. However, if donations increase or our expenses change in other ways that we're not expecting at the moment, then that will be revised. So every year, updated information will be provided and new targets for all of us to work towards.
So this is interesting. So we get some figures here. We find out exactly how much the Watchtower is needing to cut its operating budget. So this year, in the year of 2016, they were looking to slash 10% off all the branches' operating expenses worldwide. Okay, and this is the start of a reduction. The grand total, which is available elsewhere in these videos, is actually 25% total. So over 5 years, so this would be 2016 to 17 to 18 to 19 to 20 to 21. Yeah, 5. They're looking to say, basically slash a quarter off of it all worldwide. Now, the question is asked, because obviously the first year is just slash 10%, and the question gets asked, well, if we manage to slash 20% this year, if we're a branch that manages to slash 20%, does this mean we won't need to slash anything next year? And the answer the guy basically gives is, we don't know yet. Now, that to me does not sound like a guy who's confident that these finances are going to work out the way he's planning. It's not like, yeah, we've got this all costed, it's fine. This is just like a little, we do X, Y, Z, we'll get result B. It's like, we'll get back to you on that.
We'd really like you to save 20%, but expect us to come back and want 10% still.
Yeah, that's kind of the impression I got. So again, it's kind of interesting to see that they don't necessarily have that much confidence that they're going to be where they want to be by 2021. But yeah.
John, do you think they're going to hit these targets? Do you think they're going to be able to bring their spending under control?
That's a very good question. I don't think any of us have the answer. It's speculation at this point, but I do think that they are going to launch initiatives to cut expenses in order to reach their targets. And we've seen that already in the past few years. I've had friends who were asked to leave Warwick, and we know many have, lost their positions that are considered inconsequential or unessential positions at various branches around the world. And they are selling equipment. They've tried to recoup every single penny by opening up a website for Warwick to sell all of their buses and tools and equipment that was used to build that project that they had spent hundreds of millions of dollars on. So we are going to see a lot more cost savings measures in order for them to reach their budget. So it's going to be interesting in the next 1 to 2 years to see how that goes.
Indeed. And Evelyn, from a theological perspective, what do you think it says to the average witness that their organization is so drastically trying to cut its expenses?
Well, the thing that first struck me with this whole thing is that they're always saying that Jehovah will provide. And that, if Jehovah doesn't provide something, then it obviously wasn't sort of meant to happen. But time and time again, they're having to reshuffle their finances and rejig things because they are obviously they're obviously planning things that are outside of their budget. And I mean, even with my limited education, it's like if you have X amount in the bank and you have X amount coming in, you don't spend everything that you've got in the bank just hoping that money does definitely come in. You make sure that a contingency fund should actually be only there for a really sort of like last minute sort of like emergency. It shouldn't be something that is dipped into on a regular basis. But I'm getting the impression that their contingency fund is maybe used too often, because 25 million is not very much for an international organization. And the fact that they are then having to go cap in hand, and then they're also having to talk to all of the congregations worldwide and telling them that they've got to cut the spending. It just speaks to a lack of organization, and them being the most organized organization on the planet was always a selling point to prove that this is Jehovah's organization, because these things don't go wrong, because Jehovah is blessing us. And every time that there is a hiccup round the corner, look how amazing the blessings are that we get. But we're not seeing that at the moment. We're seeing hiccup after hiccup, which seems to be directly caused by their own inadequacies in actually planning.
Very good point. Now we need to have a complete change of pace at this point, and I need to quote a scripture which I believe applies prophetically to the news reading services supplied by Watchtower in Focus. In Matthew 22:14, Jesus said, "For many are called, but few are chosen." Chosen to read the Watchtower in Focus news is Covert Fade, and I can now invite you to listen to Covert Fade introduces the news.
And theme tune. So, we actually have quite a packed news schedule. A lot has been happening since we last did Watchtower in Focus, and there's actually, I've picked the kind of a lot of stuff we can deal with now. There's actually a lot of other stuff as well. So if there's something I don't mention, it's not that we're ignoring it. It's just that we there's only so much time we have. The first thing I'd like to deal with is we actually had, and I'm actually going to hand over to John Redwood to do a very brief resume of this, because we had quite a groundbreaking press conference took place in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, which it was really quite astonishing and heartening to watch, and involved some people who'll be very familiar to Watchtower in Focus and to JW activism generally. I think we are planning to cover this in more detail in other videos and other articles, but if I can hand over to John Redwood, who can give us a quick report on what happened.
Thank you, Covert. Well, in Pennsylvania news, so yesterday in Harrisburg, Representative Mark Rozzi gathered numerous lawmakers together to the state capitol right there in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And a little bit of background on Mark Rozzi. He is a legislator who actually suffered at the hands, when he was a teenager, he suffered sexual abuse at the hands of a Catholic priest. And so now that he's a lawmaker, he has been fighting tooth and nail to get a law passed which will eradicate the statute of limitations laws. Now, Pennsylvania and other states have improved their statute of limitations laws, but remember, we have civil and criminal, and their laws currently state that in a criminal case, once you turn 50, you can't file or request a criminal investigation into a child abuser. And that's a problem, because you may have been suppressing your information about a child abuser that harmed you, but then you find out that someone else that you know, or more than one person, actually abused these other people, and you want to be able to add your voice to tell the police. But if you're 50 years of age or greater, they won't let you do that according to state law. And if you want to file a civil suit, once you turn 30, the same thing applies now. So that statute of limitations stops at year 30 for civil and 50 for criminal. So Representative Rozzi wants to end the statute of limitation laws completely, and he also wants to have a retroactive law in effect so that it will go back 2 years for anyone who desires to file criminally or civilly. So what happened was yesterday at 3 p.m. in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, right on the steps, the rotunda in Harrisburg, there was a massive press conference, and Representative Rozzi gathered together not only people who were victims of the Catholic Church sexual abuse, victims of priests, but he added Jehovah's Witnesses as the second major group to join the effort. And our own Barbara Anderson had an opportunity to speak to the entire press conference that was there. She did a fabulous job. Barbara recently filed a filed a complaint to the Attorney General of New York, and an attempt is being made to do the same in Pennsylvania and other states. So awareness is being raised of the problem within the Jehovah's Witness organization. And this is actually very important to what's going on politically, because we don't want to target just one religion. It's not just the Catholic Church. It's not just Jehovah's Witnesses. But Representative Rozzi wanted to gather as many groups together to have a unified voice to say we need to make a change to these deficient statute of limitations laws that are on the books. And other states have better laws, other states have worse. Pennsylvania is right in the middle. Rozzi said, we want the best for Pennsylvania. So we also were joined by Martin Hawk, who we've had on the program before, and he had an opportunity to give a terrific speech, very, very motivational. And we had a lot of witnesses that drove from quite a distance, from Florida, from Kentucky, from Canada, and other states to support this arrangement. I might also mention that one of the people from the Keepers documentary was able to give a presentation. And if anyone has not had a chance to see the Keepers documentary, it was based on sexual abuse and a murder that occurred in Baltimore, Maryland, back in the late 1960s. And it led to an expose of the sexual abuse problems and the cover-up, specifically within the Catholic Church. So Representative Rossi has a bill that he's trying to get passed. About 2 years ago, the same thing happened, and it got blocked in the Senate. So now he has more support, and there were multiple legislators there that came and gave speeches to support the arrangement. So there's a lot more to tell. We might do another Watchtower in Focus on this, but I just want to thank everybody that came yesterday. It was a fantastic event. I had an opportunity to speak with Representative Rossi and ask him a little bit about what he's doing and what his chances are, and he said to me that he thinks his chances are good. But what's interesting is that the Catholic Church is strongly opposing this legislation because they don't want more lawsuits to be filed against them. And not only are the Catholic Church theologians and representatives fighting this legislation, but their insurance company is fighting and lobbying against this legislation. So the insurance companies don't want to pay out this money for what these Catholic priests and bishops have done. But the truth is that's an obstruction of justice. And Rossi pointed out that why are they spending millions when these millions could be spent to help indigent people, people that have cancer, or putting that money to a good resource. And another thing I might add is that I think Jehovah's Witnesses are really going to have a problem with this because they don't lobby politically in just about any arena. So the Catholic Church has a tremendous lobby, and they have their insurance companies. But remember, Jehovah's Witnesses are largely self-insured, which goes back to our discussion. It's a good segue back to our discussion on finances. So they have to pay for any problem that comes up, whether it's a lawsuit, they have to write a check. They don't have an insurance company that will cover that. So this is going to cost them dearly, and unless they decide to legislate or lobby themselves, they're going to have a real problem. So again, I just want to thank everybody that showed up. There was a lot that went on. We had a chance to meet with all the people who came up from all those states after the legislative press conference. WGAL from Lancaster is working on an additional program that's going to be released today, another report that's part of their ongoing documentary on Jehovah's Witnesses. David Gambacorta from the Philly.com is going to be releasing an article very shortly to follow up on his first article on sexual abuse. And there were a lot of other journalists. And one final point, the Reading Eagle just released an article, and that's interesting because Reading, Pennsylvania is the home of many of the large regional assemblies that Jehovah's Witnesses hold throughout the summer. At least 5 or 6 assemblies are held there. I attended Reading myself. And they normally have articles in the Reading Eagle about how Watchtower representatives are so great. They clean the assembly hall, they clean the arena, scrape gum off the chairs, what great people they are. But now the Reading Eagle has covered a very serious sexual abuse problem, and the witnesses are front and center, or I should say the ex-witnesses are front and center in raising awareness and supporting Representative Rossi. So again, thanks to everyone that came, and hope I didn't take up too much of your time, Covert.
Not at all. That's it's this really, I mean, as you say, John, it's a really significant event, and it could, I mean, if this legislation goes through, could open the door for justice for survivors and also for organizations that have shielded abusers to be held accountable. So it's very exciting to watch. Moving on now to a completely different type of news. Many of you will be familiar with the film Apostasy. It's a film that deals with events in a Jehovah's Witness congregation. If you go to IMDb, the IMDb description is, a faithful Jehovah's Witness is forced to shun her own sister because of a religious transgression. As the separation draws out, she starts to question the meaning of God's love. Now, this film was written and directed by an ex-JW named Daniel, I'm sorry, I'm going to get his name wrong, Cocagialo? I'm sorry.
Cocagialo, I might be wrong.
Cocagialo.
I'll have him on the channel at some point.
Yeah, Daniel, I'm so sorry for messing that up. Dan K.
Yeah.
This film has got fantastic reviews. If you've been following it, it is consistently in major publications like The Guardian and the BBC. It has got excellent reviews. It's an award-winning film. It won the London Film Festival 2017. It was the winner in the Filmmakers Bursary Award, and it's been released now on Amazon and iTunes. It's in the US only at the moment, but that is, the digital distribution will spread to more territories. I've seen the trailer. It looks like it captures the interior of Kingdom Halls very well. From what I understand, it's a very powerful, very moving, potentially quite affecting film. So if you're maybe fresh out of The Witnesses, or you feel like it's maybe a bit too close to home, just bear that in mind, because apparently it really does capture the feeling of being a witness, and the kind of the oppressive nature that can have on the witnesses. But apparently it's also quite very even-handed. It's very fair. So it's not a hatchet job on the witnesses at all. It's a very honest and open portrayal. So that's available in the US, and it will be available in other territories on Amazon and iTunes very shortly.
I haven't watched it, but I've heard, and I'm looking forward to watching it. I've heard that if you're a witness, you can't really argue with it, because it's literally just portraying what life is like in a Kingdom Hall. And it's like, well, that's what it's like.
Yeah, that's my understanding. Is there's not like a little head that pops up that says, this is why this is wrong, because blah, blah, blah. It just shows you it. So it's
Can
very,
I just pop in here and say that in the UK, it's available from the 17th of July.
Thank you,
It will be available to stream, but also in certain cinemas as well.
Oh, brilliant.
Fantastic.
Yeah, so it's getting a cinema release in this country, which will be incredible.
Yeah, and I would say, obviously, cinema releases are quite important. So if you are able to support this film at the cinema, it really will help the film, obviously the career of everyone involved, but it will also help the film's distribution. It will help, it could help, film companies decide, or maybe there's a market for stories that deal with Jehovah's Witnesses. So if it's possible to support this film, please do.
I can give you the link to the cinema that has all the details for the release, if you want.
Please do. Brilliant. And I will include it in the description.
Yeah.
So moving on to our next piece of news. Now this is a reporting on a case that's been going through the Canadian Supreme Court. I'm just going to give a quick rundown of what the case was, and then we'll sort of look at how Watchtower reacted to it. This is taking place in Canada, and it's a Jehovah's Witness by the name of Randy Wall, who was disfellowshipped in 2014. And he took this case to the courts in Canada because he claiming that basically the disfellowshipping process wasn't fair, that he hadn't been treated fairly by the judicial reviews, and also that the disfellowshipping had knock-on impacts on him. For example, he had a business now that he used to have lots of Jehovah's Witness clients, and they were obviously now avoiding him because he was disfellowshipped. So he was severely financially impacted by a decision which was unfair. And he wanted the courts to essentially I think it was to force the judicial committee to review his disfellowshipping. But there were also other issues involved as well. I believe he has a daughter who was also disfellowshipped. So there were additional issues regarding Watchtower disfellowshipping minors, and the minors going through judicial committees and the impact that would have. So there was actually quite a wide-ranging case. Well, Randy won his case at the lower courts, and it got referred to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court have had all the arguments. Now, what the Supreme Court is, they haven't found in favor of Randy. But I want to bring up a point, because Watchtower in the jw.org press release says, this is a vindication of Jehovah's righteous standards.
It literally says that, doesn't it?
It literally says that. That isn't what the decision says. And I'm just going to give an example of, obviously people will have their opinions as to whether or not the decision is correct or the decision is not correct, but I'm not a lawyer, but I want to explain why the court found the way it did, because it isn't a vindication of Watchtower. It's something very, very different. Essentially, it has to do with legal precedents. And I'll give one example. It says the courts found that Mr. Wall, for example, didn't have a right to the congregation member's business. So in their opinion, and this is what I mean by precedent, because rulings that come out of a court don't just affect one person, they affect everybody. So one concern of the court was apparently, well, if we make this ruling, it might imply that Mr. Wall is entitled to the business of these Jehovah's Witnesses legally. So it might establish this weird precedent whereby businesses are entitled to your custom. So if you're going to your local corner shop and then you stop, your corner shop might have legal basis to sue you for stop trading with them. Now, that sounds quite weird and far-fetched, but it's the kind of strange thing that happens if you have a legal ruling that establishes a precedent, because it doesn't just apply to, you can't just say, and this law only applies to Jehovah's Witnesses. Everybody is equal before the law. And you had apparently this friction between what Watchtower was doing, but also the underlying rights of the Canadian legal system. And you can read the judgment is available in detail for people to read through. But the thing I want to bring up is, at no point does the Canadian the judges say, we think what Watchtower is doing is great and ethical and it's a vindication of them. It's got much more to do with the fact that in the opinion of the judges, this isn't a problem this isn't an issue that can be solved with this ruling in this way without creating other kind of strange, weird problems legally down the road for other people. And so I'm just reporting on, what happened with that ruling, and that it is not what Watchtower says it is.
And it also seems rather disingenuous that they don't report when legal things don't go their way, but they literally leap on it the minute something does go their way.
Yeah, absolutely. So moving on to the next piece of news there, we've got a lot of news from Norway. And as people are probably aware, there's been a lot of exposés in Norway recently regarding child abuse in the media. And there's been another round of articles that have come out. Incidentally, if you follow Twitter user Jan F., which I believe is I'm just going to check the Twitter name now. It's actually someone who's directly involved in what's been going down with a lot of these.
Roving reporter in Scandinavia.
Indeed. I just want to, so even if you're on Twitter and you're interested in XJW news items, you definitely want to follow at JF Nielsen, JFNILSEN. The reporting is still going on. There's been a lot of outrage in the media and now in the government. Lots of different government ministers and government departments commenting not just on child abuse, but on the specific judicial committee process. Because what's been brought up, and again, it links into what's been discussed in Canada, is you have this issue essentially of a parallel legal system, which is punishing people and criminalizing, punishing people with severe sanctions like disfellowshipping for things that aren't crimes, such as, sleeping with someone without being married to them, for example. That's not illegal in Norway, but it's essentially criminalized by Jehovah's Witnesses, so they punish you for it. And also, basically, the way that these judicial committees are carried out, for example, you don't get, you're not even given a copy of the shepherding book, so you don't know your rights. You're not assigned a counsel, so there's no one there to speak for you. It's the fact of these parallel legal committees, and it's been talked about in the same concern as Sharia law. So the idea that, for example, certain Islamic communities have their own legal system, which is cut off from the secular legal system and may be inflicting punishments that legally, are violating fundamental human rights. And the same concern has been raised with Jehovah's Witnesses. This appears to be right at the beginning, but if you read the articles, the best thing I would do is go to XJW Reddit. And you can see all the articles translated from Norwegian. It seems like it seems like Norway's had this explosion of concern from many ministers, many government members. Now, no one's suggesting exactly what to do yet. It seems like we're at the very beginning of the discussion, and I have no doubt that it's going to be very legally complex because, as we've seen with Canada, it can be tricky to find effective ways to address this that don't accidentally trip up and maybe cause other problems. Now, I'm not a lawyer. I'm sure there are effective ways for legislators to deal with these situations, and so I'm just going to wait and see what the professionals and the legal professionals and the government decides to do. But it's really spectacular to see that in Norway, and I think this is true. It's an issue we don't always talk about as much, but it's not only the child abuse issue, but the parallel legal system of judicial committees and the way in which they are handled, which is potentially infringing on the rights that a citizen is guaranteed. That's really hit the news hard.
Indeed.
And
well, that was a fantastic roundup.
Thank you. That brings us to the end of Covert Fade Introduces the News.
Excellent. Brilliant. Round of applause. And, there was a lot to get through there, but you did that masterfully and proved why, as I said before, many are called, but only one is chosen. And just as by way of summary, how we do these episodes is that we can gather our thoughts at the end and just express what we think about what we were discussing. And when it comes to the finances, as I say, this is something that lots of people have reached out to me and said, please, Lloyd, talk about Watchtower finances and what's happening. And I think that we have learned something about Watchtower's state of affairs. Evelyn, do you feel as though you know more about the organisation and the way it's run, and the fluidity of the organisation as a result of these leaks?
Yes, definitely. I mean, every time there's a leak, you know, I mean, because I've literally really only woken up the last few months, 6 months ago, but it's these boring ones that actually in some way are more telling, because they uncover the underbelly, the nuts and bolts, the reality of what goes on behind closed doors that the rank and file Jehovah's Witnesses have no clue about. All they see is the whole worshipping Jehovah and preaching and isn't everything wonderful side of things, and the JW broadcasting sort of evangelical side, and the and how wonderful that is. They don't ever get to see the underbelly. And I think that if you can look at any organization and you can look at the nuts and bolts and how it's run and the underbelly of it, there's always going to be sort of like very sort of like mundane things there. But as long as you can point to that and say, well, look, it's very boring, it's very mundane, and yes, there might be a certain amount of bureaucracy, but if it's all transparent and it's all, you can see that everything's done in good faith, then you can have a confidence in that organization, whether it be a secular organization or a religious organization. And the more I see personally of the workings of the Watchtower organization, the more I'm disgusted with what I'm seeing, that they actually dare to call themselves an organization that is specifically being used by an almighty deity.
Indeed, that's a great point. If they just had some transparency, there really wouldn't be anything shocking, would there? Or it wouldn't be as shocking. But it's the fact that they keep everything secret and don't let people know what their income expenditure is. John, do you want to share your thoughts in summary?
Yeah, I think Covert did a great job summing things up. In both the Randy Wall case in Canada, as well as what's going on in Norway and other countries, I started thinking about what is it that religions should have the right to do and what should they be prevented from doing. One of the defenses made in the Randy Wall Canada Supreme Court case was the defense from Watchtower that they have an implied zone of autonomy. And that was a specific phrase they used several times, that religions should have this zone of autonomy, which means that they are not only self-sufficient, but that they can generate their own laws, principles, rules, whether it's based on the Bible, the Quran, whatever, and that they can apply those to their members. But here's the problem, is they are applying those laws and rules to children whose minds are still developing. And that's a problem. And that's why, as Covert mentioned, Randy Wall's daughter was involved in this case because she was disfellowshipped. And most disfellowshipped people have no idea that there's or most young people have no idea there's a Shepherd the Flock of God manual. So they don't know what the rules are. When they're getting baptized, they don't truly understand that if they leave this religion, they will lose everything. They are trapped. You have to escape this, but you do not escape unharmed. You lose everything. And the fact that that's done to minors is really one of the core issues of that trial. And I understand why the courts made the decision that they did. We have to attack this from a different angle. And one of those angles is fighting against undue influence. What should organizations be allowed to do? Because Jehovah's Witnesses and other organizations are unduly influential upon children. Really, we would like to see a situation where, you know, it's not until they are of 18, 19, 20, 21 or older where, you know, they are making an informed decision to become part of an organization. Because remember, it could cost them their lives, their family, or even their life in the case of all of these blood transfusion cases where parents are inflicting these rules, enforcing these rules upon their children. And, obviously the courts step in many cases. So I think the answer, maybe if there's a central theme to this Watchtower in Focus, aside from finances, it would be legislation. What can we do politically? So I encourage everyone to get more informed about the law. I thought about this yesterday. A lot of us are catching up. We grew up as Jehovah's Witnesses. We had no political interest or aspirations whatsoever. And while we can't all get involved in politics, I encourage as many as possible to learn more about the political process so they can write letters to the representatives or show up at press conferences, because that makes a difference. And the media is picking up on this. They're covering this far and wide. And now that the media is covering it, that is affecting other politicians who are listening and seeing that we have a real problem here. So again, I encourage everybody to get involved and do the research and study as much as they can about the process.
Indeed. Covert, John makes a very interesting point there, which is we've obviously been talking about finances. I think what we'd all like, everyone on the show and the vast majority of those listening, what we'd all like is for Watchtower to just quit being a monstrous cult and quit its abuse. And it seems the most direct way to do that is by teaching it a lesson and hitting it where it hurts. And it is encouraging to think that there are initiatives like what we saw in Pennsylvania yesterday, and I was watching on the live stream and filled with pride at what I saw. It's encouraging to see legislators potentially opening the door for more victims of abuse to come forward and claim justice. And it's encouraging to think that at some point in the future, Watchtower could potentially lose its tax exemption or charitable status. Do you foresee a possibility of that happening, or of Watchtower being crippled beyond repair financially at some point?
I'm starting to think it's more and more likely. I think, interestingly enough, one of the videos we didn't cover, the 2018 Finance Contacts Meeting video 1, they make a big deal about how vital the non-profit status is. It saves them millions, apparently, and they need to protect it at all costs. They kind of basically, almost in those words, they say we must protect this. And what will happen, hopefully, is if enough in public opinion around the world, in kind of, liberal democracies where the governments have to respond to the will of the people, I mean, if Watchtower becomes as toxic as Scientology, and we're already seeing efforts underway in the US to try and strip Scientology's tax exemption, and it has actually been stripped elsewhere around the world. I think in France and Australia, they've actually stripped it. I think we could well see, first of all, I think they're going to start losing. I mean, in Australia, if you follow the media coverage in Australia of Watchtower refusing to cooperate with the ARC recommendations, it would not surprise me if Australia was the first place to strip it. I mean, I'm not a prophet, but I wouldn't be surprised. And in terms of the wider finances, they admit in the videos that America is the hub of all the money. It supports everything else, and the Western world to a certain extent. Well, we're seeing stagnation and slowdown in the West. We're seeing lots of people leave. We're seeing Watchtower getting, as we've seen from this video, they're not on the verge of bankruptcy, but they are urgently having to slash everything down, and they don't want to. They admit it's not because the literature is not going away because they want to. It's going away because they have to. In just 3 years, we've seen huge amounts of public pressure. We've seen massive squeezing on the finances from child abuse lawsuits. That's going to get worse. For example, as John Redwood pointed out, if this happens if this Philadelphia, there's just one example. If Philadelphia laws go through, lots of witnesses will be able to sue. And overall, as we're starting to see people waking up, people leaving, the growth in the money generating West is stagnating, and the places that are growing are not the places that generate the money. I think we are going to see, who knows if they'll go bankrupt with it. They may do at one point. They're definitely going to get a lot smaller. They're definitely going to have to start coming up with explanations as to why they're closing things down. I mean, my basic suspicion is that there'll probably always be Jehovah's Witnesses because there are still Bible students. But the Watchtower organization, the way we think of it, that can go bye-bye very easily. Bigger organizations have crashed and burned. And it may take some time. But I think the peak of this organization is definitely behind it. And the question now is, how fast is the disintegration?
Oh yeah, the heyday was like in the sort of early 90s.
Yeah.
And it's arguably been on a downward spiral since the beginning of the century. I believe that the best case scenario for Watchtower is that it shrinks beyond recognition towards more of a Scientology model, where it's all about real estate holdings and that kind of thing. The worst case scenario is that it could go bankrupt, and people recoil at that and think, a religion can't go bankrupt. If you can take out loans, you can go bankrupt.
Yep.
So it will be very interesting to see where this goes. But we've basically run out of time at this point. I cannot thank you guys enough for adding your insight, particularly Evelyn for joining at such short notice. So John Redwood, Covert Fade, and Evelyn Delahombre, thank you so much for joining me for this episode.
Thank you, Lloyd.
Thank you.
And I better go because I think the Bourne accountancy is climbing through my window. Oh no, he's here! He got it!
Justice seems to have caught up with Covert Fade. Sadly, we'll see if we can rescue him. But viewers, if you've enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to subscribe for more. And as always, thank you for watching.
Say to the world I'd die if we were falling apart. Going to work, smiling as we're falling apart. You lie to your friends as fine as you're falling apart. Soon